Good afternoon. All right, how's everybody? My name is Gerald Linmore. I'm with the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, and I'm going to be your MC for the 3 days that we're here. Right now, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Oscar Dubon, who is the Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion at UC Berkeley. Oscar Dubon.
All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of Chancellor Carol Chris and the Division of Equity and Inclusion, welcome. My name is Oscar Dubon. I'm a Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, the follow-up Vice Chancellor to Dr. Naila Nasir. So I'm really delighted to be here and filling those big shoes. We are thrilled that UC Berkeley and the Johns Hopkins University have joined in co-hosting this significant event. I'm really thrilled that you're all here to have this really important conversation. We'd also like to thank the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society for doing all the great work in organizing this and really convening this conference. This is such important work, especially now. UC Berkeley, with its strong tradition of public service, has been steadfast in using its voice, its scholarship, and its energy toward the common good for all, especially our most marginalized communities. I think that's work that is a lot of heavy lifting right now that we're all feeling, but is really important work and really should be the mission of higher education and certainly Berkeley as the leading public institution. I also would like to acknowledge that today we are standing on a lonely land, and I really feel that it's very fitting that we recognize that in the 150th anniversary of this campus. And to really see how this work connects to the lived experience of Native peoples, understanding and finding ways to correct injustice, inequality, and really making sure that we become a better union, so to speak. It is fitting that in this 3-day conference, Race and Inequality in America, the Kerner Commission at 50, that it really takes place here. As you know, the free speech movement has been in the news for very good reasons, as well as the hate speech movement, I'll say. And that's something that is part of the discussion that we need to be having about how we as institutions also view and engage in this type of work as it relates to the types of actions that are happening outside of the institution and coming to force us to have certain types of engagement. Today we find ourselves at an important crossroads. 5 decades after the Landmark Report, many, if not most of the issues at its core remain. When I think about the idea of a nation that is unequal and separate, it seems that that's something that was stated 50 years ago, but in fact, it remains. And I think understanding more deeply how we have not been able to move forward the way we need to, as well as the progress that we have made, is super important right now at this very moment when it feels that separation is even moving further, not just economically, but ideologically, and in so many other ways. We really are becoming much more polarized in a way that really hurts all of us, especially when there is so much inequality when it comes to how society is being separated across racial lines, ideological lines, and other types of identities. So I think that this is really something that is just so fitting. We must be committed to address the systematic and institutional inequities underpinning the current report, which are still painfully evident today, lest we find ourselves merely continuing a discussion, one already 50 years old. And I think a lot about that in terms of our own institutions. Sometimes we don't need to look too much beyond outside of our offices to really understand that structural inequality, structural racism, still exists in our institutions, even as we internally are striving to change those. So what does it mean to, and the conversation with John Powell really raised the important issue. What does it mean, for example, to have racism without racists? I think that's really an important discussion because especially when we engage academic communities that involve the inflow of so many young people who really want to do good, who see themselves as progressive moving forward, what does it mean for the structures that they come into in the academy to still perpetuate structural inequality, to perpetuate racism, even as themselves they don't see that. And as you know, institutions are just microcosms to what happens more broadly. So how do we deal with that conversation around having racism with not always having racists, but instead having the structural racism that happens throughout, including at our own institutions, and I'll say including at Berkeley, which is something that we need to acknowledge. As this important conference opens, let us continue to be vigilant, creative, and bold as we march towards justice and the real work that we must do to arrive at a place of fairness and equity. So I am really thrilled that you are here. This work is super important. It can't just stay within the confines of Poly Pavilion and the UC Berkeley campus. It really must go much beyond that. And we can't wait another 50 years for progress to happen. We really have to have progress now and find ways that we can mobilize for that progress to impact not just the intellectual academic side of society, but also in very practical ways across our communities, especially our urban communities. So with that, thank you so much for being here, and I'd welcome to you all, and I'd love to bring to the stage John Powell.
I thank all of you for being here, and I thank Oscar for the work he does at ENI. I think the last time I saw Oscar, we might have been watching the Black Panther movie. Some of you were there. Let's see. So I'm going to make a few opening remarks and then introduce one of our special guests. We have many, Sean Donovan. Some of you may know of Sean's work. And a lot of things have happened in the last 50 years, and some things have not happened. So part of the thing we're doing is looking at 50 years, the last 50 years, and we could go back more than 50 years. There's a friend of mine, Dorian, who talks about understanding the United States. You can think about it in terms of 25 decades, 10 decades, and then 5 decades. 25 decades of chattel slavery and dispossession of Native Americans from the land, first 250 years of the country. And then 100 years, 10 decades, of formalized Jim Crow, taking us up until the 1960s. And then the last 5 decades, having a new racialized system, including mass incarceration. So this history has been with us throughout our entire existence, and it's taken on different expressions. And what the Kerner Commission really does for us is to help us to understand some of this history. The Kerner Commission was incredibly important. It probably was the first major effort by a government where the President of the United States created a commission of 11 people, equal number of Democrats and Republicans, someone from industry, scattered across the country from different states, and they came up with a unanimous report cataloging what was going on in the country. Why was there more than 100 uprisings in 1967? And you could go back further than that. What was the cause of it? Not just what happened, what caused it? And they put at the forefront white racism. Whites having racism against blacks and institutions and structures. Now think about that. This is the government saying that when we look at all these uprisings, we can't understand without understanding white racism. So what happened? And why did it happen? And what should we do? What can be done? So this is what the heart of the Kerner Commission's report was. And it came up with a 500-plus page report. If you count the appendix, it was over 600 pages. A weighty book, 600 pages. And it sold millions and millions of copies. It was a New York Times bestseller. So it captures the country's attention. But very few of the recommendations that was part of the report was actually implemented. And in fact, many of the things in the report was actually visibly attacked. In other words, the country moved backwards rather than forwards. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. So one of the things that the report actually noted is that almost every rebellion was triggered by accumulation of circumstances. And if you looked at almost any indicator, segregated schools, underfunded schools, inequality in terms of jobs, and it talked about language, used language that we wouldn't use today. It talked about Negro ghettos. And ghettos is just another way of talking about how you isolate people from opportunity. The word, as you might know, was used very prominently in describing Jews in Europe. But many of these incidents was also touched off by something that's unfortunately very familiar with us today. That is the police brutality, if not shooting, of a young African American. And so names like Martin Chambers, who was killed in 1967 by the Tampa police. And the people who were there noted that he was running away from the police, and when the police shouted, he put his hands up, and then he was shot in the back. Unfortunately, if we just think of Ferguson, that same scenario is played out today. Or the Watts riot, which happened a year earlier. Or the Harlem riot, 1964, where again, someone supposedly had a knife and the police shot him. And then a standoff between the police and the community happened. And one of the people walking by, getting off the subway in the midst of that riot, was a young man, soon to be a star basketball player, named Lou Alcindor. We have Hunters Point, right here in the Bay Area, which had this expression of this. And all this is actually as a function, almost inevitably, of not only depressed conditions, inadequate resources, ghettoization, but also police brutality. In 1967, I was in Detroit on January 25th and 26th. And some of you may have seen the movie Detroit, where 3 young black men were killed by the police, and 9 other people were brutalized. It's called the Algiers Motel, which set off days of rioting, and all of them were acquitted. So this history is not even history. This is what's happening in our country today. The difference is, in 1967, President Johnson said, I want to appoint a commission to take a serious look at this. And he had a couple of recommendations. One was, you could only be on the commission if you didn't criticize the war in Vietnam. That was one of the litmus tests. And he charged them with coming up with a truth and honest statement. And they did just that. And one of his more famous lines, the commission talked about the country becoming divided, 2 separate countries, one black and one white, and unequal. It also talked about blacks understood something that whites refused to understand. That is that the ghettos were the creation of white society for the benefit of whites. This was not self-imposed. If we were to bring this up to date today, we wouldn't talk about 2 societies. We talk about a fractured society. We talk about a polarized society. What we're seeing now is a resurgence, or I should say, an expression of white ethnic nationalism led by the President of the United States. And it's not just happening in the United States, it's happening around the world. And so, but this divide along racial lines, where we attack people because of their race, because of their immigration status, because of who they are, is actually even more pronounced today in some ways than it was 50 years ago. And the commission talked about blame, and it blamed white society. And again, I think if we talk about this today, we'd have to actually complicate it a little bit, because in reality, there's not one white society, there's not one black society, one Latino society, but there is some expressions. A New York Times story recently identified that up until recently, about 15% of the population identified itself as white pride or white nationalism. It suggested that since Trump has arrived on the scene, that number has doubled. So now about 30% of whites identify as being white nationalists or white pride. And by extension, that is hostility toward the racial other, hostility toward the religious other, hostility toward anyone who is in any ways different. And so this is more pronounced in some way than it was 50 years ago. Consider these policy proposals. So we need more low-income housing. We need to think about also the location of that housing. We need to address things like stop and frisk, which some of you may remember was a huge issue in New York just recently. We need student loan forgiveness. We need a better clicker. We need basic income. We need higher minimum wage. We need a living wage. We need universal income. Now, where are these policies coming from? Now, if you go on Black Lives Matter's website or go on the website, if it's still there, of Occupy, you'll see many of these policies and others in terms of education. How do we actually have effective and good teachers in schools throughout the United States? How do we bring the public and private sector together to create millions of new jobs? Where did these policies come from? All of these policies are part of the Kerner Commission 50 years ago. So many of the policies that we talk about today are in the Kerner Commission. But interestingly enough, they don't actually just talk about these policies in isolated terms. Yes, we need more housing. Yes, we need better schools. Yes, we need better jobs. But they talk about in terms of a fabric as a system within the United States. And they don't just talk about needing these policies. They talk about how to pay for them and how to implement them. And virtually all of them have been ignored. And one question in terms of learning from it is, why have these policies been ignored? Excuse me. It's easy to be cynical and assume that, well, were going to be implemented anyway. There was no chance these policies were going to be implemented, but that's not accurate. And this is important because history is full of contingencies, which means it's not inevitable, which means if the past is not inevitable, neither is the future. What happens and what we do and what we don't do matters. So Johnson was skeptical of the recommendations. Even though he instituted this commission, he was skeptical, but he's also deeply brooding and kind of in a funk. He was starting to be increasingly unpopular. He had just lost the Tet Offenses in Vietnam. It was clear he was not going to run again. And so he was not willing to use any more capital for domestic programs, and he turned his back on the Kerner Commission. So without his leadership, where's it going to go? At the same time, you had what some people might call a Trump light in Richard Nixon. Nixon saw an opportunity. He saw, especially in the South, this sort of brooding resentment toward the civil rights movement. He stumbled on a phrase of law and order. He didn't actually plan that, but he stumbled upon it, and he shot up in the polls. And then he started using this phrase over and over again. Interesting footnote, 1967, 1968. As far as I know, and I didn't do a scientific study, but as far as I know, there was one major television program on television at that time dealing with law and order, and it was Dragnet. Now you can't turn on the television without, in any channel, seeing just literally dozens of programs about law and order. What most people don't understand, that concept of law and order comes from that period. That was Nixon's language to basically say, these black people are out of order. We need repressive laws that put them back in order. So Nixon getting to the White House, in a sense, was running against the Kerner Commission. He was running against what Kerner Commission was actually proposing. But there was another person who was running for the Kerner Commission, who had a real chance of winning, and that was Robert Kennedy. Now, if Kennedy had lived, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about this today. I don't know what we'd be talking about, but we'd be talking about something else. Because Kennedy believed, and this is by his biographer, Arthur Schlesinger, he believed in what was being asked for, what was being demanded in the Kerner Commission. I just shared that with you that it wasn't inevitable that Nixon was going to be our president, and it wasn't inevitable that the country was going to turn its back on the Kerner Commission. Another thing that's important is not just that the country was inextricably, deeply racist and it couldn't move beyond that. These things happen through leadership. These things happen through events. These things happen through stories. These things happen through imagination and engagement. And so instead of getting the engagement and imagination of Robert Kennedy, we got the imagination and engagement of Richard Nixon. So the Southern strategy, which was to galvanize the resentment of the South in order to turn back the civil rights movement. Now, the Southern strategy, as you know, has been with us, and you're going to hear from Ian Haney Lopez, who'll talk about that. That strategy has a long history in the United States since the Civil War. The country has had three parties since the Civil War: the Democrats, the Republican, and the South. The South has been totally organized around racial hierarchy, and they're willing to make common cause with either the Democrats or the Republicans for the purpose of maintaining racial hierarchy. And so you have the Dixiecrats, and then you have the Reagan Democrats. What's different today is that the Southern strategy has become a national strategy. And so it's no longer consigned to the South. We have a national strategy in terms of racial resentment and hostility and other resentment. And so it's not just directed at race or blacks. It's directed at anyone who's considered not a legitimate part of the country. And that group has to be carefully chastised. And one of the things that Nixon came up with, and this is John Ehrlichman, he came up with the idea of a war on drugs. And at the time, the country did not believe, as a country, that we were having a drug problem. But Ehrlichman said there were two enemies to Nixon that had to be held in check. One was hippies, and the other was black people. And he said, we can't just go around arresting hippies and black people, but what we can do is create a policy that has that same effect, and that was the war on drugs. So the explosion of the criminal justice system actually had nothing to do with crime. All it had to do was, how do you actually basically jail your enemies? How do you lock up all this potential energy and take the country in a different direction? So the Kerner Commission, in some ways, was part of a very important history of the United States trying to deal with race. So you had W.B. Du Bois, who really broke from Booker T. Washington in terms of the role of black people in the United States. You had Gunther Meredith, American Dilemma, written in 1944, who did the first major study after the Civil War and after Reconstruction as to what was the American dilemma. And the dilemma Gunther Meredith talked about was that here we have a country founded on the concept of equality, but it's deeply racialized. So here's a contradiction. We say we believe in equality, but then we institutionalize slavery. So another sort of interesting footnote of history. One of the most interesting, popular, important speeches, political speeches in US history is the Gettysburg Address. And it's only like 2 pages long. And it was actually extremely controversial. Lincoln gave that speech after the Gettysburg, where thousands of Americans died on the battlefield. And he gave the Gettysburg Address. And after he gave that address, a number of conservatives, including members of his own party, demanded that he be impeached. Now, does anyone other than Jack Boger know why after Gettysburg, they demanded that he be impeached? If you know the answer, you get a free copy of the Kerner Commission, and you don't have to read it. Anyone? 77 years ago. What had happened 77 years prior to the Gettysburg Address? Declaration. Why was that controversial? not the Constitution. Lincoln was basically saying the Constitution is a slave document and is deeply flawed. And so he was saying the Constitution is not a founding document. It is the Declaration of Independence, which inscribed the concept of equality. The Constitution inscribed the concept of slavery. And people understood what Lincoln was saying. And he ended the Gettysburg Address by calling for a new birth of freedom. A new birth of freedom where the whole country is united. Now that seemed like a radical concept at the time. Some people might say it's a radical concept now. And then we had the Kerner Commission, which actually emboldened those concepts and not only said, how do we become one United States? When we first started calling ourselves the United States, we said the United States are. The states are, because it wasn't one country. And it was the aspiration to turn it into one country. And the Kerner Commission helps us think about how to achieve that aspiration. So why should we commemorate this report? The primary goal must be if we really want to be a nation, if we want to be a singular nation where all people are counted and included. And we do this by recognizing that we have many differences, but there's a way in which we can all come together. And I talk about this in terms of bridging versus breaking or bonding. And bridging is when we connect to people or situations that are not our own. Of course, some of you may know that there's no such thing as our natural own. What counts as our own and not our own is a matter of deep cultural and sociological grounding. So breaking is where you think the other is a threat. And what we see and what we've been seeing for the last several years is that the rise of right-wing and white ethnic nationalism is predicated on the notion that the other is an ontological threat. The concern of the other is a much better indicator of right-wing nationalism and authoritarianism growing than economic dislocation. I'm not saying economic dislocation is irrelevant, but it is the threat of the other that is much more significant. Bonding is basically saying we just care about our own people. And bridging is recognizing, literally, building bridges. So breaking, which says these people are ontological threat, naturally leads to how do we actually control or get rid of those people? They're not us. And so it's a narrow concept of we. And those of you who are lawyers will recognize in cases like Dred Scott, where the court, the Supreme Court, including Justice Taney, argues that blacks, free or otherwise, could never be part of the political union, could never be included in we, the people. And Johnson, and by extension, the Kerner Commission tried to correct that. Now, if you believe in dominance, white dominance in particular, then equality seems like a challenge. So in some ways, you could say the Kerner Commission is the road not taken, but the road is still there. And we have not taken that road, only gone slightly down that road a couple of times in history. But it's an opportunity to take that road now. But first we have to understand, why is it that repeatedly, after the Civil War, Reconstruction, all these times, the New Deal, why is it every time we face this, we've chosen not to take this road? So I think there's a reason for it. I've suggested some. One is going back to just the accident of history. We got Nixon instead of Robert Kennedy. Accident of history. Lincoln got killed after the Civil War, and we got Johnson instead of Lincoln leading us into reconciliation. Contingencies in history. We got Putin's puppy in the White House instead of Hillary Clinton. I mean, so there are all these possibilities, but these possibilities are not inevitable. And if we think about how we actually turn this around, there are a number of things that can happen. And one of them, of course, is if we participate, if we vote, it makes it harder to ignore this. Because the majority of Americans still believe in equality. They still believe in the American dream. So we need to plan to move forward. And I'm about out of time, but let me just say a couple of things. It's easy to be cynical. It's easy to be depressed. It's easy to think that we should all move to Canada. But we need to do our work right here. In some ways, I would argue that in many ways, the Kerner Commission is being implemented here in California. The Kerner Commission is being implemented in states like New York, where they just adopted universal pre-K. Not enough, but there are expressions of people, large numbers of people in government, trying to lean into, trying to make us a society where everyone can thrive. And I think there are different options. And these are the options that are set out by the Kerner Commission. If we were to talk today, we probably would change these options. In terms of Kerner Institute, they talked about opportunity mapping and how do you distribute opportunity in a fair way. What we talk about at the Haas Institute is how do you create a circle of human concern where all are in the circle? How do you actually make this a country where everyone belongs? I think we can do that, but we have to be deliberate.